maybe I'm going to get the get-go now, and first of all, and say, this is, I'm very happy to be joined here on this specific webinar dedicated to sustainable mining investment in Brazil with three of, the maybe most knowledgeable voices, according to me, and with key expertise on the topic. There, on top of this, three good friends of mine. So this is really having a virtual dinner at my house, or maybe lunch at my house at this time with a feijoada, or with whichever what we all bring. But that's a great panel, I believe, to talk about sustainable investment in Brazil. We have, as you know, this series looking at different ESG best practices, looking at different jurisdictions. We did Peru, we did Ecuador, we did Mexico recently. We will do Colombia very soon, and other countries outside of Latin America also. And I thought for Brazil, having both Rolf Fuchs, Rafael Benke, and Cândida de Mello was a very good panel to discuss about this and try to highlight the best practices in ESG and the state of the situation, especially in terms of mining regulations, in terms of overall regulations a year ahead of the upcoming elections, where a lot of uncertainty will be and eyes will be geared towards Brazil. But at the same time, it's important to mention what has been achieved today and what will remain very structural to the situation of mining in Brazil, giving a large overview. And maybe I want these discussions to be as informal as possible. You can just post questions on the chat. We'll look at it, and all the panelists will be able to answer also some of the other contribution of each. I'd like to turn first to Cândida. Thank you again. Cândida, really a pleasure to have you here. We've been working, you and I, on overall regulations and risk to investors to a series of sectors, mining being one, but also infrastructure. Can you just, for viewers that will download this video and look at it, to try to understand Brazil as a jurisdiction in terms of the regulations and the specific case of Brazil as opposed to the neighboring countries, can you give us a little bit of an overview of what has been done over the last 3 years in regulations, and more on mining, obviously, but you can also give some example of other sectors if you wish.
Of course. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Well, it's hard to say in such a short time frame what has been going on in the regulatory world of Brazil. I think there was a huge advancement in terms of maturing of the federal agencies, regulatory agencies. The setup of INEM is one of the major developments, right? To set up finally one sole federal agency to look over and inspect the whole sector was a big achievement, let's say, from a regulatory perspective. Of course, there is, the beginning and then the initial steps of this agency looking into maturing its regulatory role and also developing its inspection role. It's not easy, right? But we have seen very dedicated teams, especially, I would say, the hot topic of the regulation in terms of INEM nowadays is the dams managing. We've seen a draft regulation come out for public consultation. It's probably now on the verge of being published as an effective regulation. In my opinion, it brings much more legal stability to the relationship of all the stakeholders with the dams and how to reuse the tailings, and it establishes a procedure. So it will be, once effective, it will be a huge advancement in the mining sector. I would say also we've seen developments in the discussion in the Congress of the mining code. Nothing major at this point. There's a lot of discussions on smaller topics. There is an expectation that the current commission will finalize the assessment of the proposals to amend the bill very soon. But it's always something that we've been discussing with our clients, what to expect, what's coming next, and when do we expect to have the new mining code effective. It's been a discussion for a long time, and for now we've been using what we have, which is the old mining code, and trying to work with the smaller detailed regulations that are coming out from INEM. Also, I think there's a very hot topic at the moment about using the mining titles and the mining rights as guarantees for capitalization of the projects, and that is really a game changer for investors. And there's some uncertainty on how to effective those granting of those rights. So we are also expecting, there's a public consultation going on at this time. So we expect the market to come out and include contributions to INEM, and then INEM will assess those contributions and possibly come out with a new regulation about the procedures of how to grant those mining titles as guarantees.
So maybe before transitioning to Rafael, and you mentioned a lot of issues of tailings that are linked to the E of ESG, but elements of price public consultation that will, elements that we'll discuss also in the next steps of this webinar. Just maybe looking at the calendar, and because we're just 1 year before the elections, we're in the process of all this. How likely is it, according to, I could ask any Brazilians that is knowledgeable of the timeline in Brazil, to see this pass through Congress before the elections? If it's not the case, I mean, the elections, we obviously, the different candidates will arise. Lula has been, murmured as being running another time for potential president. But the other candidates that we're seeing, from João Doria to others, are in other regions in Brazil. But how likely are we supposed to see like a no structural change to this in case there's a new administration? And what is the terms of calendars and changes to possible to see in the near future?
Well, first of all, the dams regulation is under the umbrella of the INEM, so it doesn't go through Congress, which is great news. But in any case, everything that's political will be affected, in my opinion, during this last year of government, right? So the elections timing everything will become very sensitive to elections timing. So from April on, everything that we don't see coming out until April, I would say that we'll hardly see coming out until the end of the year and the beginning of the new mandate, right? But specifically about the dams regulation, because it's INEM, it could be the case that it would be ready before April, and it would be effective before that.
Perfect. And maybe as a reminder for people that need to know more about Brazil, I mean, we've seen, even with swing of different parties and administration, some kind of position that was pro-mining projects. Even during the Lula administration, there's been a series of developments. So we're not looking at a complete swing to anti-mining movement, and the mining sector is very strong in Brazil, and one of the main element of the economic wealth of the country. So don't expect potential changes that we've seen in Central America with other countries in Latin America. We are still fairly bullish on Brazil. And maybe turning to you therefore, Rafael, on those issues when we talked about the tailing and the development of the Agência Nacional de Mineração. When you actually talk about ESG in general, do we see also increased reforms or demands from other actors, not necessarily from Brazil, of having new regulations in place in terms of consultation of communities, of indigenous communities, maybe specifically? Can you maybe bring us a little bit up to speed in terms of the latest development in Brazil? Oh, you're on mute, Rafael. Yeah, that's okay.
It was just, to keep the practice of being muted. But thank you so much for the invitation again, Remi. Very pleased to be here with Ana Cândida and Rolf, and very experienced practitioners in this area. And let me congratulate Embellie, because I think you're doing a very, very active and straightforward work in our region. And I think you are practicing SDG 17, if I may say. I think you've been a huge builder of partnerships, connecting international organizations with academia, with companies, with civil society. So congratulations for all your hard work and innovation that you've been bringing to players with whom we have contact and are pleased with your work. So
thank you very much for this. I appreciate it.
And with that, I think we are entering, I think, a very interesting debate. I think the four of us are very brave in having this panel now, because we're competing with Glasgow, which is not an easy competition. But I think what we're talking here is also very connected to what is under development there and in other fora. And so we have this international agenda as a permanent development and being incorporated by best practices in sustainability for literally decades, right? And the recent years, we've had this convergence towards the acronym of ESG, meaning, you know, the sort of the common language where capital would also meet what operators have been doing for a long time. And people like Rolf and Cândida and yourself who have been part of these and seeking better performance in companies. And I think how we've throughout our lives have struggled in the interface between licensing and regulatory requests and what are good practices is a good starting point for this discussion, right? Your last question to Ana Cândida, what changes with elections next year in Brazil and some other countries in the region, and what should we envisage for 2023? I think operators who want to respond to the title of this panel need to think beyond ups and downs of the governments that will be in place at that specific moment. Having said that, two interesting things. Firstly, for some of our partners and clients before this government was elected, there was a very similar question to what you asked. And what we said is you should seek guidance with better practices that you can find internationally. Your commodity is demanded internationally. It's going to be traded not only in Brazil, but internationally. Your capital is international, and increasingly the bar that is being set as a reference is of international practices, right? So if the regulatory bar will go up and down, you should not guide your practices by that bar, right? The other interesting point is related to what we saw in the current government in Brazil. And I think we've seen a lot of debate and discussion and turmoil, I would say, on how this government, the executive power, would behave. I think an interesting conclusion we have is that from what we saw in terms of promises and the ideology behind it, we didn't see a transformation in the regulatory system and in the legislative system all the way that we would see had the promises being fully fulfilled. That means that the check and balances in the Brazilian structure are working, and that is a signal of maturity in the democratic system in Brazil, where you have a legislative power, where you have a judicial power, where you have the pressure of civil society, of private sector, and this interaction brings more balance towards the management of these aspects that are so fundamental for investments. And where I would stop and then leave maybe for a second comment is that, especially in the last 3 years, we've migrated from very clearly and now with more teeth than in the past is what we should do in terms of what is necessary and what is nice to have, right? So all of us here have been discussing for a long time beyond compliance, right? What is compliance and what is beyond compliance? So today, if we want to respond to your provocation, Remi, of doing sustainable mining investment in this region, we can say that licensing is necessary, but not sufficient, right? And beyond compliance is not anymore nice to have, is a must have. And I know I've had conversations with BMA colleagues where Ana Cândida works, and with Rolf more than once, how many examples we have of what we see today as beyond compliance being mandatory, right? And if we want to do an investment and don't have don't have issues and struggles, we really have to think beyond that bar and really incorporate in our must-haves beyond the licensing, right? So we can discuss more about this, but as an introduction.
Yeah, I'll turn to Rolf, very briefly soon on terms of looking also at different regions in Brazil. But I appreciate your words here on this topic, Rafael. Looking at going beyond, the compliance and the basic reporting, and especially, achieving that social license to operate, or that capacity to trickle down, inclusive development, which doesn't cost so much money. It's more effective and much more, working with the right stakeholders and working with a large, 2-3 years plan on those issues, and being able to achieve that support from different stakeholders for your project, which is now needed. I mean, it's very good to be able to do your ESG certification, to report to different organizations, but you have to bring up, especially on the S and the G, social and governance elements that sometimes are not, only included into the environmental licensing. You need to go by the book, obviously, but be proactive. Sorry, that very good name, Proactiva, for your company, Rafael. But be proactive on those issues and be able to develop, those best practices in Brazil. And I like maybe therefore to turn to Rolf. Obviously everyone knows Integratio, and thank you from being from Minas Gerais right now, probably my favorite region in Brazil. Sorry for others, but I mean, I actually want to have this vision also from Brazil, from within. Obviously, and we talked about the federal level. We talk about international questions from Glasgow to ESG to international reporting for investment. Now, if we look at Brazil, Brazil is not a country. Brazil is a continent. It has very different realities on the ground. There are some more traditionally mining jurisdiction, Minas Gerais would be one. Others that are, for different reasons, not so much, positive towards mining, or that have the same resources, obviously. But I'd like to get a view of what are areas that are potentially more interesting for investors interesting into sustainable investment. I mentioned again capacity to do things well with a clear planning in their hands, and therefore integrate those ESG best practices that we keep mentioning, and where that could be more interesting in Brazil. Very long question, Rolf, but I know you could be even better than me in the future. You're on mute, Rolf, also.
I used to say that this pandemic period have to pass, and we will never learn to unmute our. So that first, Remi, thanks for this invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm very glad to share this panel with Ana Cândida and Rafael, and both already started with very important and good contributions. And but you picked up my beginning of my argument, because I will say that we have many Brazils inside Brazil. So Brazil is a continent. But in our different or in our actual situation, talk about ESG and sustainability and responsible business and all this, compliance is not easy. If we look on our government, for example, the environmental area in the Brazilian federal government was a mess in the last 3 years, and all the world is going against this. But we don't have nowadays very good political practices in the environmental sector in Brazil, and I can say the same in the social area. And so it's a period that we have to live in. And like Ana Cândida said, we will start election periods. I don't agree with April, Ana Cândida. I think it's already started. Our political process have already started.
Officially.
Yeah, officially April, yeah, but Okay. But yeah. So nowadays, for the near future, we have to wait what will happen. And but what will happen is different in each Brazil inside Brazil, in each country inside Brazil. And so this is more linked to your question and talking about specifically about mining. We also have different mining jurisdictions in Brazil. We have favorable regions, we have opposites region, unfavorable regions, and we have different situations in each case. But I will say in general that mining is a good business, is a good activity in Brazil. In general, Brazil is favorable, is a good mining jurisdiction. But the reputation of the mining sector was very, very damaged through the last main tailings dam failures. We had another couple of failures, but in smaller dams. But the last two in Mariana and Brumadinho, well, that's make the reputation of mining in Brazil suffer a lot. But different jurisdictions. The best regions in Brazil nowadays for mining, in my evaluation, is the northeast of Brazil, mainly Bahia state, but also Rio Grande do Norte and Alagoas. We have in the center Goiás, is a very mining-friendly jurisdiction, and Mato Grosso as well. And Pará is a good region for mining, but Pará is part of the Amazon, and I will talk a little bit about Amazon in particular. And we have two regions that I mean they are the most unfavorable for mining in Brazil, for responsible and good mining. That's the south, Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, concerned to ideology, cultural aspects, and all of this. But it's very difficult to develop a mining project in the south of Brazil. And the other region that's very turbulent nowadays is here in Minas Gerais. Exactly linked to the tailings dams.
Yes. And maybe just to continue and build, and I appreciate for this geographical overview and the specificities of each region. If I want to focus on the region that are more favorable, so I mean, you mentioned Bahia, you mentioned Goiás, even Minas Gerais with the opposition, which is completely understandable by the tailing failure in the past, as is becoming a little more challenging, but still an area that has interesting capacities of development, sustainable mining, and there's long-standing operator there. When you're looking at those specific regions, you still have very specific above the ground risk. You still have very specific, potential impact, whether it's the risk from garimpeiros in the northeast of Brazil, or it's issues of just the specific understanding of working with these communities in Goiás, for example, or in other state there again in the north of Brazil, in Maranhão, for example, Amapá or others. What would you advise in terms of maybe just pointing out to one or two practices or projects? I don't want to make we're not here to make publicity about anyone, but just to share best practice. What would you advise in terms of something that you think was very effective in being efficient in those new up and coming jurisdictions, Mato Grosso, Pará to some extent, Bahia, also Goiás, which is not the traditional most historic state in terms of mining in Brazil? Would you want to highlight one or two practices, and then I'll turn to Ana Cândida?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we have very good examples. I highlighted the Northeast more for they are looking for development and more industry and to grow up. But we have a less environmental sensitiveness in this area. That's the different case of the Amazon region, because the people from the Amazon, including Pará and other states of the big Amazon region, they are favorable. They are they welcome mining activities, but the world works to maintain preservation of the forest. And so we have a lot of external influence in the Amazon. But even so, Pará is nowadays the biggest mining state in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
But Bahia is already the third one, and Goiás the fourth one. Minas Gerais is still the second, very close to Pará. And so there are very good, very fantastic good examples. And I mean, some good examples are occurring nowadays, some projects being implemented in Mato Grosso, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Mato Grosso is part of the Amazon region. And they are dealing a lot with garimpeiro conflicts, artisanal miners, illegal miners, dealing a lot with local political weakness. And but they are going well. Are going well to implement a huge project. I can name the company I'm telling about next, Aripuanã project. Yeah. In Bahia, we have a lot of good examples, like Largo Resources, Vanades de Maracás is a reference in diversity, inclusion, people respect, technology, innovation. They are going a lot. Just yesterday, they announced that a new huge investment, a new project, and standing live mine and all this. So fantastic projects. This project from Largo was recognized as one of the 3 best in the world during the implementation, according to Equator principles. So since the beginning, they are aware and they are conscious that it is necessary, it is beyond compliance, like Rafael says, to work well. It's not only nice to have, but it's different. It's a
And we're citing projects and operations. Obviously, there's no the webinar are completely open to there's no financial links here on any kind. But our objective is just to highlight that to be successful in Brazil here is because if you can be successful if you have the right management team, if you are ready to think above and beyond for a couple of years. I'm not thinking about something out of the extraordinary, and even in very specific challenging situation. Rolf mentioned the work in the Amazon, for example. I can mention one of our partners in the Nation Sustainable Development Solution Network. They have a specific network of communication with these communities, and we contribute to this. There are plenty of different actors that can bring at third parties or mediator or operating actors on the ground to help a mining company if there is a will to implement sustainably and well different operation. And there are a series of those companies there. You mentioned very well, and then I turn to Ana Cândida. You mentioned the influence of different forces preserving the Amazon forest, which is completely understandable, and we all also participate in COP26 projects right now. But obviously it has a cost, and you have to see how to sustainably develop well-structured projects and therefore fight against garimpeiros or fight against criminal activities and other miners, especially in the gold sector in the Amazon forest. Those are problematics that we touched upon on the Guyana Shield in a previous webinar. But maybe the specificities that there is to Brazil, and that's where I'm coming to you, Ana Cândida, is the kind of litigation that you have very often in the country. I mean, if we compare Brazil with Peru, Chile, or even your other jurisdiction, African jurisdiction, definitely more onto the European framework of law, you have a very much influence of American legal system where the place of different actors and local judge has a strong impact on the development of a project. Can you just brush upon this? I think that's very important for investors to understand.
Yes, it's a very good question. And while Rolf was speaking, I was kind of taking mental notes here on what to say, because he actually touched on the 2 main regions that I would say that have the highest level of litigation in terms of project implementation for the mining sector, which are Minas Gerais and Pará, basically because the highest number of mines are located there, and the development of these businesses or these mines as businesses is higher than in other regions of Brazil. First of all, I think Brazil is a litigious country, let's say. Mm-hmm. Issues that go wrong tend to go to litigation, and parties usually resort to courts to get injunctions and try to accelerate activities, especially in terms of getting into operations. So I would say for greenfield projects or new projects, the highest level of litigation will usually be related to environmental licensing and engagement of stakeholders, especially communities surrounding the project. So that's, I would get back to you on you know, how important it is to try to manage those relationships in order to avoid the level of litigation and to avoid that local judges will handle very complex matters through which they sometimes will not be totally prepared, right? So that I would say that environmental licensing would be one of the major topics of litigation in the finance sector. And especially once we're talking about world-class projects, bigger or higher level of complexity involving those licensing processes, right? About the brownfield projects, I would say that the hottest topic for litigation is, again, the dams and the tailings. And of course, the recent history that Rolf mentioned increased a lot the number of lawsuits that are dedicated to those topics. That's why the first topic that I brought in your question about regulatory developments, the fact that the INEM is regulating tailings management and dams management as a whole is a, let's say, matter of the day, right? To try to avoid that. There's also issues related to CFA, related to other revenue and discussions that I could mention, not very hot topics at the moment, but always something to look into once you're discussing litigation.
Perfect. And then Stefan is being, royalties regimes and others in Brazil that we're not going to be mentioning here, but happy to answer any question in the future. And by the way, please do send any question that you have, and all the panelists are always open to answer further notes and comments. I'd like to maybe turn to Rafael on this. When we talk about litigation, I mean, a lot of litigation movement that we're seeing in other jurisdictions are linked to previous consultation of communities. Some companies are usually more able to handle this because of work that has been done in other jurisdictions. I'm thinking about Canadian companies specifically. You're very much involved into Canadian companies circles. We are also with a partnership with through your Global Affairs Canada with Da Vinci Initiative and others in other countries in Latin America. Here in that case, what is maybe when you're looking at a series of the Canadian actors operating in Brazil? I mean, there's Yamana, Equinox Gold. There's plenty of them, too many to list them. Do you see developments of ESG and approach to proactive approach to prior consultation, to community activities and rights to local content, to try to limit potential litigation in the future on this field specifically? Because I do see obviously the kind of litigation that we're seeing on tailings, which is a classic after events, maybe trickling down to issues much more on social and governance that needs to be tackled in a country like Brazil. So I'd be happy to listen to your perspective on ESG, and especially through your work with Canadian companies.
Thank you for the question. I think the litigation component is an interesting hook because even as Ana Cândida says, we have unfortunately a huge evidence of litigation in Brazil. This is just a segment of the real problem underlying litigation, because when the issue pops up and emerges into a litigation, it's just a fraction of a lot of what's going on.
Absolutely.
So it's a very bad indication that we have so much litigation. And the question is, how are our practices? And how to which extent our regulatory frameworks and the spaghetti bowl of legislations and regulations at a federal level and state level and so on, bring more confusion rather than a reference for good work. And sometimes what we see, and it will be interesting to hear Rolf also commenting on this, is that sometimes companies tend to be attracted towards battlefields of what is right and wrong in legal terms, and sometimes take too long to take a higher road and just take another instance of how to approach things, right? For certain matters, we see more precision. And the other day we were discussing, Remi, we were mentioning, and this is a global phenomenon, how much in the environmental segment of the three letters ESG, we tend to have more precision, more process, more tools, more indicators that are more conducive towards better practices and better performance. On the other hand, we tend to see and even express that the S and the G are more challenging. Curiously, a recent study that was published in the University of Geneva regarding discrepancies in ESG ratings shows that the largest discrepancies that we have is not in the E, of course, we knew that already, but not in the S, but in the G. Which is curious, because I would say that the discrepancies we don't see in S yet is because the S is so poorly referenced that not even the discrepancies can be noticed yet, right? But
on these notes, yeah. I mean, and I don't want, you do have an evolution of a series of different certifications, but also of tools. I mean, we'll probably do a webinar specifically on this to be able to get this data collection. And we did mention some of different platforms that, very, very useful, or different data collection on S&G. But indeed, you mentioned discrepancy in a harder element of be able to quantify what is essential to the sustainability of investment, which is, the social license to operate, and a contribution to governments and local governments. And that'd be very interesting. Maybe, I know you worked, and maybe before transitioning to Rolf, you've done some recent work, especially on human rights and mining at Proactiva, and especially linked to a series of new legislations from the UK that look at modern slavery and actually address specifically mineral resources and supplies to Europe. So that might be something very interesting to maybe brush upon if you can, and then I'll turn definitely to Rolf to answer that question.
Yeah, and actually, that was your original question, and I think answering that, I think not to point to specific companies, because I may be unfair to the good practices of others, but I think what is interesting is companies that are understanding this new design of what the system requires for a good performance, which is the play that we're doing with the words of going beyond the what is now must have. Maybe in the past was a nice to have, and then the beyond compliance becoming really the necessary and sufficient for a good performance. So what we're seeing is that not only Canadian companies, but in many nationalities, and also Brazilian companies, that take a proactive approach in understanding what is this ESG, let's say, reference, and understand their gaps and understand their risks. Based on this, they will have a more anticipatory approach towards it and avoid problems. Problems means that eventually they may turn into litigation, as Ana Cândida was bringing, but there are problems that are coming earlier than litigation, because Ana Cândida and Rolf will attest that one of the big villains of the discussions here has been the public attorney's office. And we heard a lot of players saying, "Oh, but the public attorney's office is coming and persecuting and asking for companies to commit with things that are not in the law," and so on and so on. What we're seeing now is a lot of ESG practices that we were seeing earlier are being forced through financing. Mm-hmm. So we are seeing some of our clients that, and I know Rolf is also working very interesting cases like this, where their finance has stalled because they were not in performance with some ESG performance standards, right? Regarding the engagement with traditional communities or indigenous peoples, because they have not pursued a cumulative environmental impact assessment, because they have not looked at areas of high conservation value as they should, and they have a plan for that, even if they are licensed, right? So I think this is a very good indicator, and we have, of course, concrete examples in the northeast of Brazil, in the north of Brazil, and even in traditional and welcoming jurisdiction like the state of São Paulo. So companies who are licensed in the state of São Paulo and had their finance stalled, substantive finance, we're talking about 800 million reais, so roughly $300 million stalled because of no compliance with performance standards. So I think this is a very interesting dimension that invites companies to a new approach.
I'll turn to Rolf to comment on this and specifically of how to engage with different stakeholders. Maybe just one line before that, because we mentioned financing, which is obviously a key element to the game here. I'll maybe suggest some of our viewers to look at the webinar we did 3 weeks ago with on financing opportunities for clean energy projects, but we actually brushed upon also a little bit on mining, was with FinDev Canada and with the International Energy Agency. So there are elements linked to what's going on in Glasgow now, in terms of tapping into carbon finance, tapping in terms of protecting some areas and being the warden of some areas, and be able to tap finance to be able to develop sustainability in projects. So there are a few avenues. I just wanted to mention this for people that want to dig deeper in terms of the financing and being more sustainable in the financing. Maybe just to Rolf first, because I mean every time we mention good practices on the ground, your name comes up. That's good, especially from Rafael. What can you give us your comments on what Rafael brought in terms of managing stakeholders on the ground and different realities from different regions, obviously? Yes.
Yeah, very good question, Remi. But first, I have to agree with Ana Cândida and Rafael that the legal and regulatory process in Brazil is for PhDs. I work with this issue of sustainability and social responsibility since the 80s. Mm-hmm. And I saw a lot of different interpretations and all of this. 20 years ago, a project that I helped to develop received the first audit of Equator principles in Brazil, mm-hmm. almost 20 years ago. And since then, this pressure for financing on all this is there in a different way. Now it's very stronger, of course. Mm-hmm. And in Brazil, it's not so easy because, like I said in the beginning, we have each differences in each region. Rafael mentioned the traditional people or indigenous communities or not, but I don't know if you are aware that we have more than 160 different categories of traditional communities and people in Brazil.
Yes.
We are not talking only about indigenous peoples. We have maybe 300 different indigenous communities, but we have 160 different categories. The most known of them are the indigenous people and the quilombolas, the slave descendants from the African slaves, but we have 160 more. And the regulatory process for each one is different. The rights and the procedures are different. And sometimes they don't have procedures established. And you have to try to look at the best path to build a good relationship or a good environment for a project, not only mining project, each project. Yeah, so the social license to operate is necessary since the beginning, because if one of these stakeholder group is against a project, he will share this with others and multiplicate this with others, and you will not receive your project will not have future. Yeah.
Yes.
And these traditional communities, the occupation of the Brazilian territory is about 25%. So it's a lot.
I agree, and there's, I mean, and we do very good work on this, and we know other of being able to just try to identify those communities, try to identify what it means for companies and what is the potential risks and what is the process specifically for those companies. I like the angle of litigation, specifically when I worked for developing this webinar, because I know it's so important in terms of Brazil. It's also very important for company managers or investors to understand it's better to be proactive on those elements, because it's going to be way more painful at your wallet when you're going to have to go through the litigation road. So it's much better to be more advanced on ESG practices and go a little bit overboard, because this will be your secretary blanket when it comes to limiting your costs down the road on your investment. And this is not the case only in terms of mining. It's also, and that's where I'm coming to you, Ana Cândida, in terms of working in terms of correlation with other sectors, whether it's the energy sector, the agro-business sector, which has done a lot of work in the past in terms of trying to have a better reputation of its sector through agro is pop campaign or others, which the mining sector would be maybe well advised to try to develop another approach to this, to show the benefits of the mining sector to sustainable development. I'll ask a few questions on this to Rolf and Rafael afterwards, but just looking at you, Ana Cândida, on these issues of litigation, on these issues of potential sectors working together. We're seeing on port and infrastructure how important it is to secure minerals to arrive to the port and others. How do you see the capacity for cross-sectoral collaborations in terms of developing and vision of development of territories, basically a regional or local development of territories, a narrative, an idea, a project with different sectors that would help convince stakeholders and investors that this is really an anchor for local developments? That's another question for a PhD, but you're way better than PhDs, Ana Cândida. I know that you can actually take care of this.
Well, I could speak a lot about this, but just to mention, I actually had in mind commenting about development of new projects through the PPI agency. Yeah. I'll set that aside just to make a comment. I've been, in the context of COP26, I've been reading a report prepared by some of the multilateral banks about how infrastructure can be set up to mitigate the effects of climate change, and also as a tool for sustainability development. And that's actually a huge shift in approach, right? I remember Rafael mentioning a shift in approach in, I think, his first answer to your question. And I think that is the, let's say, the next frontier of the infrastructure as a whole, right? The way we look into infrastructure, the way public policies for infrastructure setup are defined, and actually thinking about infrastructure as a mitigating factor and not as the risk creation factor, right? And I think there is a lot of opportunities for intersectoral approaches. We always, being a lawyer who looks into so many regulated sectors, I always take a lot of advantage of knowing what has been done successfully in one sector and trying to bring that experience into another sector. So I think there's a lot to be explored in that sense. And I think that is very the effect of that is underestimated most of the times. People think about sectors as worlds by themselves and not as worlds that are connected into the whole universe of infrastructure. And I think that the approach will change as we progress into a more high-level look into all of those sectors and try to communicate the experiences and the lessons learned and try to connect them all into one sole view of communities, of development, of social and economic development in that sense.
And I appreciate this, and maybe building on this and turning to Rolf. I mean, we worked recently on questions on infrastructure. Obviously, infrastructure bill in the US, something that we looked at, or being based in Qatar, infrastructure is basically what the largest developments that you can imagine. And I'll be there in a couple of weeks. I won't recognize Doha from the time I was living there, obviously. But that's important to look at how those investments, large investment, integrate the territory and allow us to trigger sustainable development goals. I mean, that's the whole work that's been done also by Columbia University, CCSI, on mapping, the mining investment to the SDGs and the reaching of key goals of, whether it's gender, it's governance, it's social, it's local development. I know, Rolf, you have quite the experience in working on issues of local content, on issues of, trying to work on inclusive development and different approach to, building, cohesion between stakeholders, going beyond the words. I mean, the ESG is a nice acronym and so on, but then you have to go down into, the everyday life of being able to see through local content processes, through selecting, partners, through working on the daily time, on roundtables and others. How do you see, the mining sector in Brazil being able to perform better, if I may? Without being too critical, the mining sector is so big in Brazil compared to other countries. Same thing in Peru. Sometimes that is as kept in terms of being, the steady structural kind of well acting, but some catastrophe right and left, but without trying to be also proactive. Do you see these capacities in terms of the Brazilian mining sector, and how could that be the case in terms of implementing new best practices in terms of those trickling down in inclusive development? That was a very long question, Rolf.
Yeah, but first, talking about infrastructure.
Yes.
If you don't have infrastructure, you never will have a mine. You still have a deposit, but never will have a mine if you don't have power lines, roads, integration, and all this.
Yep.
And usually in the history of Brazil, and this is the fact now, talking about territory, mining was the activity that opens Brazilian territory for the population and all this. Since the time of colonization, the people looking for gold and diamonds discovered Minas Gerais, and so the frontiers opened inside the country, not only on the coast.
Mm-hmm. And
so this still happens if you go into remote areas, because the most part of the mining projects without Minas Gerais, São Paulo, or other regions have to develop new regions, new territories, new infrastructure. But these territories are already occupied by someone. Someone is there. And you cannot invade the territory. You need to share this territory with the others, with these people that is there. And the territory is not only the mine, but all what surrounds the mine, the influence region, the infrastructure region, communities, government, taxes, regulatory process, all this. But nowadays, in the actual time, if you don't respect culture and local practices in this territory, and in much cases, activities against mining, you will not have a future, not have a project there.
Mm-hmm.
For example, a traditional fight between the illegal garimpeiros that I mentioned before, with the legal mining procedure, industrial and serious mining.
Mm-hmm.
We worked in a lot, more than 20, 30 projects that we worked together with garimpeiros. We could implement mining projects with garimpeiros. It's not necessary that two parts that imagine that they are in the opposite side of the coin, they can discover that they are on the same side. But it have to be a sustainable development for all of them. And this is very good possible too. It's possible to build.
Inclusive, collaborative development with different stakeholders. There's different ways to do it, traditional means and roundtables, up to platforms of participation that allows to really see the interest of each one beyond the simple reporting. Can I maybe just turn to Rafael? I see there's a question from James. I'll let you read the question if you want, Rafael, but I wanted to turn to you on maybe the last and helping me conclude this panel. Maybe if you can address that one also, is the importance of the mining sector in terms of fighting against climate change, basically. I mean, Brazil is home to key deposit of minerals that are essential to battery metals, to copper and others that are very essential to renewable energies and projects such as this way. The absence of Bolsonaro in Glasgow obviously doesn't help making the case of how the mining sector could be a strong participant to a transition in energy and to participating to this fight on climate change. But what do you see the possibilities there in terms of making that point, in terms of being able to move forward on key projects and developing those resources, especially into the battery metals that sometimes are facing opposition?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'd like to connect something that Ana Cândida and Rolf tackled, which connects to your question, right? I think you had earlier asked Ana Cândida about how infrastructure in other sectors should work together. She said about the sharing of best practices, but I think Rolf used terminology that is fundamental for, I think, a shift in paradigm on how we approach this, right? Which is a territory is shared. A territory is shared. It's not because you have a concession that you suddenly own that territory. There is a preceding history of that territory. There is context to it. And you are one of the players that is coming to that territory, right? I think if we come with this, from this standpoint, I think things start being designed and planned in another way, right? I think if we speak of the social dimension, one of the big challenges today is the so-called shared value, right? How can I share a value if I don't understand that I am stepping into a territory that is already shared, that I don't own? And what we see traditionally is a bilateral relation of the company being the central pillar, and then how I relate to my stakeholders to the extent that I want or not, because it's all voluntary and it's part of my corporate social responsibility that I will do or not, right? So I think we moved a long way from that approach, but we need to really sediment, to really consolidate this approach that we're talking here. The starting point is what Rolf said of the shared territory, not only shared and the idea of a common territory because of traditional and indigenous peoples. It's not that point only, but I share with other players, with other operators. This is why I have a cumulative impact in environmental arena and the social arena and all and I should think of my programs in a combined way. Absolutely. So I shouldn't be too worried about my sustainability report, but how do I generate sustainability to that territory? So if we come from this standpoint and go to climate change, a key critical question for Brazil, the most fundamental one in climate change for Brazil, is how do we keep forests living? How we keep our trees standing, right? If a large mine, will use 3, 4, 5% of the footprint of the concession, why cannot this mine be a catalyst, be a solution for keeping the forests standing? right? So I think this thinking of mining as a development agent and not a necessary evil is what we should work with. And I think a very forefront, a strong criticism towards the mining sector in Brazil as a whole, because I think we are doing a poor service in really thinking the sector as a development, a sustainable development agent in Brazil. And that is a burden for every single mining company in Brazil, because the sector as a whole is not collectively doing its work.
Absolutely.
A final word about climate change. Climate change, a key issue for climate is emissions. So if you're a small company or if you're a large company, if you have the majority of countries in the world with a fixed target of neutralization by 2050, it means that all economies are going to be reframed to respond to that goal. If we have a coalition of banks responding to trillions of dollars in investment in a coalition setting a target of 2040 neutralization, it means if I am part of that portfolio, I may be welcome or not. So I have to understand what is my emission. If I don't have an inventory, that's a big issue. And we have to remember that in mining is part of the solution and part of the problem. And we have to equate that. So we have some commodities like lithium, cobalt, nickel, that are fundamental for the sustainable products, for the green products, the green technologies. On the other hand, we have certain minerals that in their supply chain, and I'm talking about scope 3, are complex, right? So we had very recently top mining companies committing to neutralizing scope 1 and 2 by 2050, right? That's excellent, scope 1 and 2. Scope 3 of these mining companies represent 90% of their emissions. So where the challenge lays is in
the reduction of those, yes, absolutely.
In a scope 3, which means the full supply chain. Full supply chain is a challenge for climate change and is a challenge for all the aspects that we discussed here. So for social and so on. But this is where we're going to bring real sustainability if we really tackle the full dimension. Sorry to expand a little bit.
No, that's okay. I appreciate this, and I think that's a great way to conclude this. I want to keep the idea of mining in the mining sector being like potentially a catalyst for development and shared value and of the territory. And we've seen this on many cases in terms of bringing energy in some cases in Africa, for example, but to come to bring better governments, better practices, and being able to make that case. The mining sector has the capacity in some conditions to participate to those joint solutions through collaboration with other sectors, can make the case on key projects of protecting the forest in some cases, or of trickling sustainable development through sound projects and policies and processes in local content or in other approach. So I like those words that you say, because I could actually really add my name to this. Thank you, Rafael. As always, those panels are always a good starting point, and that will create a lot more questioning and thoughts. I've seen the question from James. I have your answer, so please send me an email and then we'll organize something. And as always, please send emails if you want to continue with the different speakers. In that case, it was quite funny to actually have all 3 of you with me on the Zoom call, because I'm usually used to our daily chat on WhatsApp. So I actually have your face there, but I will probably turn back to daily chat on WhatsApp starting tomorrow. But I'm happy to continue this conversation further, and looking forward to a nice dinner post-COVID in nice feijoada or rodízio, whatever you choose. Foi prazer falar com você, e estou pensando muito a próxima possibilidade de seguir a conversação no Brasil. It was a real pleasure, and I'm looking forward to this, and thank you again for joining me on this webinar. Take care. Thank you.